the priorities of American society, and to some extent the priorities of the world, they're just sad. I'd be much more inspired by a society that said there's going to be some death. People have a responsibility to make themselves safe if that's really what matters to them, but we're not going to force everyone not to live fully for a year in order to protect. And maybe this sounds a little scary, but to protect the weakest among us, to protect those who are near death anyway, and to protect those who are really unhealthy in many cases because of their own bad choices.
Well, it just reinforces Rand's view of how altruism, the needs of the weakest are what dictate society, and this is the evil that runs the society. Yes, everything is geared towards the people who are most in need. And you saw this in spades in this pandemic. And then the other thing the pandemic showed is just the inability of people to think, just to use basic reason, basic logic, basic statistics. I'm not even sophisticated statistics, but just basic stuff. No capacity to think probabilistically.
Right.
And assess risk. And on both sides, by the way, this is, I consider some of the people who, I saw some doctors say, oh, this is no big deal, and throw out some statistics. And they were just as incompetent and stupid as the people who said, oh no, we're all going to die. And it was on all sides. And it was just, this year, it was the saddest year I think I've ever had in that sense. My evaluation of the culture has just gone like that. Things are much worse than I thought they were.
I talked to some people who are still fairly optimistic about the American spirit, but basically, and I don't want to be cynical or indulge in gratuitous negativity, but I'm very worried about the spiritual, psychological, physical health of American society.
The entire Western world, and American society was better than the rest. And we become just like Europe. There's no difference really.
Yeah.
We've lost what makes us America. My conclusion from the year is, we're all becoming China. China won the intellectual debate, right? So we're all mimicking China. Trump, I think, was mimicking China industrial policy, and Biden is continuing that. We'll talk about that a little bit.
Yeah.
I think we mimic China on lockdowns, and we couldn't do it quite as tough as them. So we're kind of soft lockdowns because we're not quite there. Europe did exactly the same thing.
Right.
Nobody mimicked Taiwan, which is the only country that made any sense in this whole thing, where they basically did testing, tracing, isolating of people who are sick, which is what the government should do, and the only thing government should do. And it worked. They had very, very few cases, even though they have proximity to China and lots of Chinese people in and out. So it just was depressing in that sense. Just seeing left and right, the pathetic nature of the arguments, right looking for any cure, and any kind of conspiracy theory. Drug companies suddenly became the villain, even for the right.
Right.
And then misuse of statistics across the board. I know a little bit of statistics because I used to be a finance professor, so that's what we did. And man, the misuse of statistics. They always are misused, but this year was just out of control. And then, so that in that sense, and then of course I'm used to traveling. I'm used to being in an airplane all the time and speaking so I did a lot of talks online, which is fine, but it's just not the same.
No, but you really thrive in person. You ready to get underway then?
Yep, let's go.
Okay, awesome. So one thing I'll say at the outset is that I'm not an expert in economics. I'm just sort of a layperson who's interested in these things. And I'm also not coming into this conversation with a particularly strong perspective in any direction. This is just a truth-seeking mission. These are questions that I'm interested in, and I am just genuinely curious what you think about them. And so what I want to start by asking is just a very, very broad question. And then I want to get into a more specific question. The broad question is simply, what do you think the state should do?
Well, my view is you have to ask the question, why do we have a state? What's the purpose of the state? Why do individuals need a state? And I would argue they do. I'm not an anarchist. But I think you have to understand kind of the moral foundation of the moral purpose of a state. And I think we have to start with the fact that, from my perspective, the moral purpose of a human being is to live the best life that he can, to live a moral life, to live a happy life. And that requires certain things. And more than anything else, it requires that a human being be able to think for himself, to use his mind freely, to come to whatever conclusions he comes to, and to act on those conclusions. And that requires freedom. That requires the ability to think, to express oneself, free speech, for example, and then to act on those thoughts. And I think that in the 18th century, they came up with a concept, in a sense, capture this idea of freedom, this idea of the freedom of the individual to live his life as he sees fit. And that is the idea of rights, of individual rights, the kind of the Lockean notion of rights. Mm-hmm. And so I think individuals have rights as a moral necessity, so that they can live their lives to the best of their ability. And the right really means that you have the freedom of action to pursue your rational values, free of coercion, free of interference, free of fraud, free of authority that impose their will on you. And again, this comes from the experience in Europe of authorities, the church, the state, authorities that dictate to people how to live, what profession to have, who they could marry, and what discoveries were acceptable and what discoveries were not acceptable.
And
the state, therefore, is the guarantor of those rights. So the state, therefore, sole purpose is the protection of those rights. So the state is there to protect you from the fact that when we come into society as individuals, we now are exposed to people who might want to impose their will on us, might want to defraud us, might want to use violence against us. Maybe that's, and typically that's only a minority of people, but it's still a significant minority, and force is a significant, is a major deterrent to thinking and acting. So the role of the state is to protect us from force, and it's to help define or define in legal terms. Objective means to decide who initiated force and who didn't. This is not necessarily an easy thing. To objectively define what are the boundaries of property rights and when are they infringed and when are they not. And property rights are complicated, and certainly in the internet age, they've only become, in a sense, more complicated. So that is the role of the state. It's to help define these boundaries and procedures, and then to enforce them, to protect our rights. So police, military, judiciary, that's it. Protection from obviously violence and fraud and theft and all of those kind of criminal offenses. But otherwise, and to arbitrate disputes. If the two of us have a contractual dispute, mm-hmm. One option could be for the state to arbitrate that contractual dispute based on the principles of property rights.
You're not an anarchist. You believe there should be a state. The things the state should do include, the state should make it legal for people to acquire private property, to inherit it.
Well, I see it reversed, right? They're not making it legal. They're recognizing your legal right to your property. They're not making it legal, but they're helping define what it means to own property.
Right. Okay.
It's not always straightforward.
Okay, so they're recognizing an inalienable right to private property.
Yes.
To acquire it, to inherit it, etc. In your ideal society, murder would be illegal, theft would be illegal. There would be a police force to prevent those things, interpersonal violence, theft, etc. I think you also think there should be an army for national defense.
Definitely.
Correct? Okay. Definitely. And it was interesting you mentioned fraud, because fraud, what is the principled argument for having a state prevent person X from committing fraud against person Y?
So fraud, in a sense, I view fraud as violence. Fraud is a way of gaining a value from you without your consent, because your consent is undermined by the fact that I'm lying to you. So to the extent that I gain a value from you without your consent, that is a form of violence.
Oh, interesting. Okay. Gotcha. Okay. And
again, it's not easy to define, right?
Yeah.
Exactly. And you need legal philosophers, you need a legislature, you need laws that clearly articulate what is fraud and what isn't fraud, what is just advertising versus what is fraud, right? Because you could have advertising that's, hyping versus what is fraud. The two things are not the same, but it's not obvious. I don't have an answer to every one of the borderline questions, right?
Do you consider abortion a form of interpersonal violence or not? No. Okay.
So there's no person. There's a living being, but it's not a person. It's not an individual human beings, and rights can only apply to individuated human beings. You're only getting rights once you're born. Once you're born. Outside of the womb, yeah.
Okay. Two other specific questions about state functions. Okay, well, actually three. So one regarding, how in your ideal system would the revenue be generated?
In an ideal system, to some extent, it's hard to tell, right? Because there's a lot of time to think about this. But I'd say primarily through voluntary means. I think voluntary contributions to government in support of the police and the military. I mean, I have no doubt that my challenge would be that the government would have too much money, not too little. Also, you could imagine certain revenue, certain things that the government could do that would generate revenue. For example, if the two of us had a contract, and we could have in the contract private arbitration and private mediation and arbitration, but if we wanted the final authority to be the state, that is government courts, if we wanted that to be the final authority, we would, let's say, have to pay a fee to the court system in order to be the final guarantor of the contract. And that would fund the courts. Because think about some of the big contracts that corporations sign with each other. I think patent offices, copyright offices would generate significant revenue. I think there are a number of things, ways in which you could generate revenue for certain services that are provided. But I think that the bulk, particularly for the military, things like the military, would have to come voluntarily. And I think one of the advantages of that is the state would have a very hard time engaging in war unless it was popular, right? And they would have to convince the people that it was popular, because otherwise people would hold funding. They, and even if you think about even World War I and II, which certainly one, I think, was one of the dumbest wars in history, certainly for the United States to intervene. But they had to sell war bonds, and there was a whole campaign to sell war bonds. And they made an effort. Today, they go to war. They don't care. I mean, they just run deficits or whatever, and they just go to war. There's no consideration of how it's going to be funded and convincing people of the justness of the war.
Hypothetically speaking, if voluntary contributions weren't sufficient to prop up a sufficiently strong police force and army and court system, et cetera,
then the people will get the society they deserve.
Gotcha. Okay, so you have an absolute opposition to taxation, like forced taxation.
Forced taxation, absolutely. And again, when we get to everybody paying 5% flat rate across the board, and a bunch of taxes are zero, that'll be a great day. I'll be celebrating. Right?
Right, exactly. It won't be perfect, but it'll be a lot better than the current situation.
Exactly. But I do think that the perfect system, and ultimately the system that is sustainable, because I think a 5% tax is not sustainable. First income tax was 7%, only on the top 5% of owners, I think. And it very quickly, because of World War I, became a tax on everybody, and tax rates went through the roof very, very quickly. So once you establish the precedent, there's no limit to it. You need to get rid of the precedent. So yes, I think that voluntary taxation, I'm against coercion. So I'm against coercion, even if it's done by a majority, right? So it's democracy doesn't legitimize coercion.
So what about monopoly prevention? Do you think that is a proper function of the state?
No, and part of the issue is that there are no monopolies in a truly capitalist society. Monopoly is a creation of government. Monopolies, the word comes from, the term was first used by a king granting you a monopoly to do trade with India, right? And you get the East India Company, and only you can do trade with India. Nobody can compete with you. That's where the term comes from. And monopolies are, the post office is a monopoly on first-class mail. If you try to compete with them, you go to jail. There is no other monopolies. So you could argue, so some economists I question how, economically minded they really are. But some economists argue that, market power is monopoly power, but that's nonsense. And there's no examples of it in history, not in a semi-even free market. So take, for example, Standard Oil in the 1870s had 93% of the refining capacity in the United States, 93%. Wow, that sounds like a monopoly, right? Sounds like nobody can compete with them. But what economists tell us that the behavior of a monopolist is, a monopolist who has 93% drives up prices and drives down quality. And yet, unequivocally, prices went down during the 1870s, 80s, 90s, teens. Prices went down and quality went up dramatically, not even by small amounts, dramatically. Because Rockefeller understood that in a free market, since he didn't have a government protection, competitors would arise as soon as he slipped. And he constantly drove for efficiency. So why do we care? Google arguably has a market dominant position in advertising, right? Online. Why does anybody care, right? Google is free to all of us. So there's always competition. And let me just finish the Standard Oil example. And
of course.
Two things. One, by the time Standard Oil was broken up, I think it was in the 1920s, it only had 3% of the oil refining capacity in the United States. So over the 50 years, its oil refining capacity shrunk in terms of percentage in the US, not because of government, not because of antitrust, but because of competition. Other people figured out how to compete with them. And second, the primary use for oil refining in the 1870s was for kerosene, for lighting.
Right.
Who landed up competing them out of that business? I mean, completely out of that business. Well, Thomas Edison and Nikola Tesla with electricity. So which antitrust official in the government would have predicted in the 1870s that no, this monopoly is short-lived because Edison is going to come around and completely destroy the lighting industry, and nobody could have predicted that, and certainly not a government bureaucrat. So no, if you look at Alcoa and the antitrust lawsuit against them, when they had like 80-something% of all the aluminum production, prices were going down, quality was going up. If you look at IBM being antitrust case for mainframes, and yet digital was producing mini computers, mini mainframes, and then within a decade you had personal computers that completely blew that business up, right? And on the other side of IBM, there were supercomputers who were competing with them. So they'll always, I forget the name of the supercomputer company that was producing supercomputers in those days, but there's always competition. Even if you, the bureaucrat, can't see it, it's there, and the venture capital is just eager to fund it because if you've gained 87% or 90% of a market, there's probably opportunities to compete against you.
Right. So you would say, like, your main response to the often made claim, even among fairly libertarian types, that the state is necessary for monopoly prevention. Your response to that is that these people are conflating market power with monopoly power.
Well, generally, we have a culture that conflates what we call market power with political power. Political power is the power of the gun. Political power is the power of coercion. Economic power is the power of success, is the power of voluntary trade. If we don't like Microsoft's so-called monopoly, we can stop buying Microsoft products. And there are always substitutes. Think about Linux, think about, of course, Apple, but they're always going to substitute. There might not be convenient substitutes, but you don't have a right to convenience, right? And here's the fundamental point. The fundamental point is the state has no role to engage in coercive power over anybody. Yeah. Certainly not successful people, right? If you're successful, you get penalized. That makes no sense.
Last question on state functions. How would infrastructure be developed in your ideal?
Yeah, the same way it was developed originally in the United States, through private action. So the first canals were built by private actors. The first ferries were private. The first roads were actually privatized, and then government capital flew in and drove out private capital. So the better railroads were built. So if you look at the main railroad was at the Atlantic Pacific Railroad that was built during the Civil War was a pathetic endeavor that never made money, and was filled with problems and breakdowns and was not efficient. But the one that went north from Chicago through, across to Seattle was incredibly profitable, incredibly successful, and very well managed, and it was funded 100% by private capital. So the government, when it builds infrastructure, tends to take away private property. It tends to violate property rights. And who knows what would happen. Now, I think one of the reasons we got the interstate highway system in the 1950s is because government had already destroyed the railroads. I mean, through regulation. Imagine if railroads had been truly private and been allowed to thrive. Why does some of these other states have high-speed rail and we don't? Well, because we took out all the incentives from railroads to develop, and then we destroyed the business by creating the highway system. And of course, highways have lots of trucks on them. Why are trucks on highways? You'd think those would be much more efficiently moved around by trains. Again, because government destroyed through regulation, really going back to the 1870s, 60s and 70s, the whole rail industry. And there's a lot of documentation of economic historians looking at how government did that.
And if someone said to you, well, if private companies take responsibility for infrastructure, they're only going to do it if they can make a profit. The only way they're going to make a profit is if they obviously charge people for a lot of the infrastructure that today is free. For example, driving on interstates. Would part of your response be that you're paying for it with your tax dollars?
Yeah, and why, if I don't drive, let's say poor people who use public transportation today and struggle, particularly in places like California, yet to the extent that they pay taxes, they're paying for the highway system. Why? They're not using it, right? Yeah. So I would say it's great, right? Pay for use, right? Let's have everything tolled, and today tolls are costless in the sense that you put a little tracker on your car and
easy
you
pass,
get a bill. Yeah. You could toll road every road in the United States, yeah. And through GPS technology, you could just get a bill at the end for the different owners of the different roads. So there's a variety of different ways to do that. But again, the principle is, yeah, I mean, some people would toll the roads, but in an age without the convenience that we have today, a lot of people would build roads without tolling them. And that happens. For example, I lived in a gated community in California. There was a nice road leading to that gated community because it was a little removed from the rest of civilization, if you will. Well, the developer had an enormous incentive to build that road and not to toll it. Because you have access to the neighborhood. Right. And I had a huge incentive to pay a little bit of money in my community fees to support that road so that people could get to me, right? Mm-hmm. And for me to be able to get to places. Business owners who have stores or malls along a highway stretch certainly have an incentive to pay for the maintenance of that road and maybe to make it free. So maybe they pay the developer or the owner of the road, here's a lump sum, don't charge a toll, because we want a lot of people to drive here because then they see the mall and they come and visit me in the mall or my restaurant or whatever it is. So the market is super, and this is just me off the top of my head. Yeah. The market is super inventive, right, in terms of solutions to these kind of problems. We haven't allowed the market to develop because the state has basically, 70% of all the land west of the Mississippi is owned by a state entity, whether it's local, state, or federal. So we haven't had any opportunity to develop private infrastructure except in gated communities. And it's infrastructure that tends to be much better than. Yeah,
gated communities are really nice. Yeah. I'm vacationing in kind of the Jupiter, Florida area, and I've been in a number of gated communities just driving around, and it's incredibly nice.
Yeah, makes me want to move that's there. Because they're funded privately, yeah. And they take care of the roads because they use them, they own them, they care for them. Roads in Puerto Rico are just a complete and utter disaster, and that's because it's all dependent on a pretty corrupt state, and you see that across the board. And why isn't there a solution to traffic congestion in California? Well, because nobody has an incentive to solve the problem. But imagine if you could make money solving the problem. and you didn't have to go through the state in order to do it, there'd be tunnels. People would come up with ideas that we can't even imagine today.
Elon Musk.
Yeah, exactly. That tunneling technology Elon Musk has should be the mechanism by which we solve the congestion problem in LA. But instead we build, bicycle lanes and bus lanes, which only make traffic worse, not better.
Okay, so shifting now, the main reason I wanted to talk is that, I generally describe myself as a proponent of free markets. I believe that capitalist culture and institutions are responsible for the incredible advancements and quality of life over the last 100 to 200 years. So that is my view. I consider myself a proponent of limited government, but when people ask me, do I think that the state should play a role in the economy under certain circumstances, I do tend to make the following argument. And I'm pretty sure you disagree with it. And I'm open-minded on this subject. I'm certainly not doctrinaire about it. But my current view, I think, is different from yours. And I want to understand what you would say in response to this point of view. So let me just lay it out in like 3 to 4 minutes, and then you can respond. So for the last few years, I've been saying to people in conversations about this that even though states rarely succeed in fostering innovation and in turbocharging complex industrialization, states can be extremely useful and may even be critical for achieving these objectives, particularly if the goal is to achieve them quickly. And the basic argument here is that private firms have fewer resources than states, and they have to be profitable, unlike states. Having fewer resources than states and needing to be profitable, unlike states, means that private firms are less likely to have enough resources or enough appetite for risk to make the investments necessary to develop highly expensive technologies that may take decades to become marketable, like aircraft, rockets, the internet. Mm-hmm. States also don't have enough resources to make the initial investments necessary to get really complex industries going: steel, cars, ships, electronics, computers, and to protect them and nurture them in their infancy. So for these reasons, I've heard it said that the state is necessary for developing technologies and that the private sector is really good at commercializing them. One other point that I'll make in this regard is that states also at times have really powerful incentives to develop technologies and industries, unlike any incentives that companies might have. And I'm talking about total war. I'm talking about existential conflict. Total wars provide states with an unparalleled incentive, an existential incentive to develop and improve technologies, because if they don't, they're going to get destroyed. And it's remarkable in this connection to think about how many major technologies in the 20th century in the United States originated or rapidly advanced during World War II, whether it's aircrafts or semiconductors. Now, I want to immediately qualify this by saying, admittedly, in many countries, it might be impossible for the state to drive innovation or to nurture successful industries of the future. The state might be too corrupt. The society may not have sufficient human capital so that state investment is relevant. Sure. But if the state is not too corrupt, and if there is sufficient human capital, state action may be the only way to innovate and to become competitive in complex sectors, or at least to do so relatively quickly. And the two main examples that I have in mind when I think about these arguments are the US in the 20th century. I think that's a good example of state investments, particularly Pentagon funding, being necessary for hugely important innovations in the 40s, 50s, 60s, and 70s. And then the East Asian tigers, South Korea and Taiwan, and to some extent China, are good examples, I think, of state investments being necessary for the creation of really successful, competitive companies in complex sectors of the economy, like steel, shipbuilding, cars, electronics, computers, where these countries, if they had just done what they had comparative advantage in, they may never have developed these sectors, and they certainly wouldn't have done so as quickly as they did. So what do you say to that?
Yeah, so this is a pretty common argument among economists and among proponents of I'd say the better proponents of limited government, who think government should intervene in basic science and certain issues around technology. I think it's wrong. I think it's, again, I'll start with the moral point, with the philosophical point, mm-hmm. And that is, even if everything you said was true, which I don't think it is, but and we'll get to that. But even if that were true, then I'd still be against it, because so progress will be slower. So technology will take longer. I certainly don't think you use the word necessary a number of times. I don't think any of that is necessary, right? Mm-hmm. There's no proof of that, and I'll give some counter examples. But the much more fundamental point is the state has to take money from some people to give to others. That I think is morally offensive and morally wrong. It then allocates it based on priorities that have nothing to do long-term, I think, with human well-being, even in the best run states. We can focus on I don't know the exact percentage, and nobody's done the research that I know of the exact percentage, on the success stories. And we ignore the failures, probably 90% of the investments. All the research grants that went to nothing, and we don't know because we don't know them, right? Some you can see the white elephant, petrochemical and drug industry investment the Japanese government tried to steer the economy towards, and you can travel through Japan and see the massive plants that sit empty today because what we know is the industries were successful. We forget about the stuff that wasn't. And we don't have a counterfactual, right? We don't have the alternative. So you know, we now have philosopher kings deciding what technology is going to be good and what isn't, who among scientists should be invested in and who shouldn't. I think while again, we see the successes, what we don't see are the things that might have gotten funded under a different system that didn't for political reasons. What about all the stem cell stuff that could have happened if not for Republicans under Bush and others stopping it? What about all the nuclear technology that would have evolved if not for the state stopping it? You know, if the state is going to fund science, the state's going to regulate science. What about the fact that it's probably likely that if I get a government grant and my results of my study are, you know what? The world is doing great. Things are fantastic. Don't do anything. I probably will never get another grant. But if the results of my study are, the world's going to end in 20 years unless we do X, Y, Z, I need another grant to study how to do X, Y, Z effectively. I probably guaranteed myself a lifetime of funding, right? And I take climate change as an example, and maybe COVID. You know, maybe you could argue some of the stuff in COVID is related to government funding of science and the incentive that is associated with that. So I am very skeptical about government-funded science. It's true that if you give hundreds of scientists money, thousands of scientists money, which is what the government does, grants to thousands of scientists, a few of them will do major things that will have input, and we will all identify, yes. You know, the woman who single-handedly basically drove mRNA technology, right? She was a bulldog. She's a Romanian immigrant to the United States. Worked at the University of Pennsylvania for a while. And she just wrote grant application after grant. Most of them were turned down, but she was just a bulldog. She just stuck with it and she got it. We got a vaccine. Now you could say the government did it because they funded her. Yeah, but what about all the grants she didn't get? Maybe we could have, you know, saved 20 years on this. I mean, who knows? But the point is, yes, if you diversify enough, which is what government does, some of it will succeed. The mRNA technology will succeed. What about the thousands of scientific grants that were given to people who found no results? Or here's one other example just came to me. What about all the research into that the government funded, government promoted, and then the government supported into, for example, health? So, for example, what we should eat. You know, the government food pyramid. Mm-hmm. Well, there's major evidence it's wrong, right? It's just wrong. It's not good for you, and it's the cause of the obesity crisis, right? Because it emphasizes simple carbs and sugar and things like that, and fat. You know, for a variety of reasons, fat might not be that bad for you, particularly in comparison to things like sugar. All government-driven science, all a disaster, maybe have caused massive obesity in this country, massive amounts of diabetes and heart disease and so on. Do we weigh the costs of that versus the benefit that we attribute to all the other stuff? I'm not convinced that if you weighed that properly, you would get a positive outcome. Okay, now to some of the specifics. So with regard to government development of technology and its role in developing technology, I'm going to give you a website that I think, it's just an amazing resource and provide a lot of, and it's not necessarily disagreeing with you, but for those arguing for the extreme, just all government driven and everything, this guy really presents some great arguments, and he goes through the books, and so this is called, his name is, it's Nintil, NINTIL.com, NINTIL.com. He's Spanish, so you have to put on translate, but the translations are really good for his articles. But this guy is just brilliant in my view. I mean, he went through The Entrepreneurial State, that book by, I forget her name, and he goes pretty much paragraph by paragraph and questions. And he goes to the original research. So he goes to sources, right? So she'll cite something, he'll go to the citation and show what's really going on. Anyway, this is the conclusion he came to about war, because he has a whole thing about the Air Force, about the idea of he had two things that he cites. First, he says most economic historians, including, for example, an economist by the name of Joel Mokyr, Mokyr, assess the effects of war on technological innovation as largely negative, with a few exceptions, right? With the exceptions of economists, but most economists, right? Mm-hmm. The reason of the above is that war encourages a conservative approach to technology, inducing demand for existing technology. Thus, most war technology was developed prior to the war. Third point, the more developed a technology is, the harder for spin-offs of military technology to be successful. Four, more research is required, understanding the effects of military R&D, but that whole research is plagued with difficulties. There's real difficulties in assessing that. So it seems like most economic historians, and I haven't studied the literature thoroughly, mm-hmm. actually think technological innovation. And for example, World War II. One of the things that World War II did very well is leverage Bell Labs. Mm-hmm. And what it went to Bell and it leveraged some British scientists. But what they did is they basically went to Bell Labs and basically accelerated the development of existing technologies or technologies that were being speculated on. And now there was funding to go full throttle. And there's no question that happened and that accelerated it. I don't think that's true of ultimately the semiconductor, but certainly some of the other technologies. Semiconductor really did come out of Bell Labs. And you could argue about Bell Labs. Is it a lab that was really private because it was protected in a sense by AT&T's monopoly power that was granted by government? So a real monopoly in the sense that government granted it. But there were other corporate labs and other private research labs. He also makes the point about aircraft, because there's a book about, right, and he reviews the book that says aircraft development could have happened if not for. So this is what he writes about this, which I thought, what would a counterfactual look like? He says to the whole question. Imagine no world wars, no airmail subsidies, no NACA, which I guess was an entity that the government ran. Scientists working for NACA would be elsewhere. Without military pressure for NACA, GALCIT, and other Guggenheim-funded colleges would have taken the throne. So other Guggenheim-funded colleges would have taken the throne of top aircraft research centers. Aircraft manufacturing would have remained low as research advanced. Eventually, advances in this technology, perhaps even funded by manufacturers, would have enabled the construction of profitable aircraft. Following the same route, jet engines would have been integrated at some point. So I'm willing to grant that the government support was very important and that it could have accelerated the pace of development. But the mass manufacturing of aircraft for the war did not. I thus conclude here that war was not necessary for the appearance and growth of an aircraft industry, but that it could have accelerated it, Government isn't NACA, which is the one entity he cites here, isn't an example of state entrepreneurship, as apparently the ones pushing for the case for NACA forward were the Aeronautical Society, who just wanted to see more progress in things they liked. And the initial reaction of government officials wasn't very appreciative. That is, there was a lot of resistance from government, as you'd expect. So on every one of these technologies, what is the counterfactual? So, and here I think he undermines the counterfactual is much larger, right? What happens if we're not taxing people at 50% of their income? What happens if we're not taking, 20-something% of corporate profits? What happens if government is not crowding out? And we know the crowding out effect, well documented in economics. What happens if government is not crowding out private entrepreneurs, private businesses, private philanthropists from investing in science and technology? I can guess. I don't have the parallel universe in which it's happening, but we know that private entrepreneurs are interested in science, for example. We know that billionaires. Imagine if there are more billionaires, because under capitalism, I believe there'll be many more billionaires, right? Standard of living would be much higher, partially because I think they would be funding science and they would be funding science more effectively. The grant system, science grant system in the United States is broken. It is ineffectual. Even people that associate with the state funding know this. For example, one just little observation, it used to be that young scientists got the majority of the grants. Today, it's old scientists get the majority of the grants. Yet innovation is almost, not exclusively, but almost exclusively a young person's game. Think of the big breakthroughs of Einstein. Almost all of them came when he was very young. It just is. It's true in almost every field that particularly thinking outside of the box and thinking new and breaking out of the box is something, a phenomena of younger people. So, just fixing that would probably change the pace of innovation. And yet one could imagine the private entrepreneurs, private businesses would be much more oriented towards success, much more oriented towards result orientation, much more, just like I think charity would be much more effective at helping the poor than welfare. Because I think people who gave to charity would be much more interested in results than the welfare state, which I don't think is that interested in results. So the whole incentive, the whole motivation, everything about funding of science would be different. Now, would some things develop slower? Yes. Would some things develop faster? I think so. Mm-hmm. The whole landscape of technology would be different. Mm-hmm. But would it be different in a negative way? I very much doubt it. And let me add one last point. Look, wars happen. I don't deny the need for Defense Department. I don't deny the need for Defense Department to fund certain types of technology that help defend the state. That would orient technologies in a particular way. Whether that from an economic perspective is the best way to orient technologies, probably not, but it's a necessary way in order to facilitate defense, right? So the Defense Department would fund certain projects, even if they were not optimal. They would fund them because they need them in order to defend. So yeah, some developments would happen because of the state. Some technologies would advance. And again, it might even be suboptimal. But I would be for it because I think the Defense Department has to stay on top of these things and make sure that it can defend the country. So that would be my answer.
Yeah, it's actually really helpful for me because I think the main thing that you're offering in this conversation that I haven't really done in my own thinking about this is when someone says the state is necessary for the development of highly innovative technologies or the development of really complex industries from scratch in a generation or two, the move you make in the argument is to say, well, compared to what? So I don't think you dispute that as a matter of fact, in the last 100 to 150 years, a lot of technologies and industries have depended on high levels of state investment.
Well, I would limit that to about 70 years because I don't think that's true beyond 70 years.
Okay, fair enough. But what you're saying, I think, is, but let's imagine a world in which the state is radically limited in what it does, and all of this capital is in private hands. First of all, you're saying there would be more capital because there would be more wealth. And then a lot of that would be allocated toward the development of innovative technologies and industries. And who's to say that that very distant alternative universe would not birth a much more innovative, industrially interesting and advanced society than the one we currently inhabit.
Look how much universities raise today for buildings, for dorms, for all kinds of things. Imagine if they needed to raise money for research. They raise a lot today, but they could raise 10x, 100x if government wasn't crowding out the funding, and if entrepreneurs and the society generally had more. I would be delighted to fund basic research into an area that I particularly liked or was enthusiastic about. But and that's true of, think about Elon Musk and Jeff Bezos wanting to go to Mars. Wouldn't they be funding technology and funding science, basic science that would make that possible? So I think that's all. But let me present one counterfactual that also relates to that actually existed, that also relates to developing countries, right? And that counterfactual is the 19th century. Arguably, the century with the most innovations, biggest innovations that changed human life more than any other, right? The state was not involved in electricity. The state was not involved in, it was involved in railroads in the US, less so in Britain, but only to, I think, the detriment of railroad development, not to its advantage. But they weren't involved in the steam engine. They weren't involved in the massive innovation. So if you look at government spending on R&D and basic science and technology up until World War II, it's as close to zero as it can be. And yet, if you think about the big stuff, the things that really changed our lives, from medical discoveries to electricity, to everything we have today, that's the era. You mentioned steel industry. Well, the steel industry was not funded by the government. Mm-hmm. Indeed, the government tries to interfere, because when they try to consolidate the steel industry to create a, quote, so-called monopoly, the steel trust, the government ultimately tried to break it up. But yeah, that all happened organically, naturally, without any intervention. We got a steel industry. We got all kinds of industries at the late 19th century, early 20th century, that really drove everything we have in the 20th century. Now, yes, we got some additional innovations in the 20th century, but much of that, if you study Bell Labs, the amount of innovation that came out of Bell Labs is unbelievable. It's phenomenal. Then, the whole idea that the internet was created by government and all of these technologies, I really encourage you and people to look at Nintel's detailed, right?
Yeah, I will definitely check that out.
15 blog posts analyzing this. He admits that sure, they had some effect, but it's way overstated and way, it's become kind of popular lore, but it's just untrue with regard to most of these things. And it's what happened, it's a complex interplay of university scientists. Are we arguing that there wouldn't be university scientists without the government? I wouldn't argue that. With some government funding, with some Department of Defense projects, with private entrepreneurs, private research labs, and venture capitalists. It's a complex interplay of all of those. And it's not true even that the private enterprise is only good at application. They were involved in some of the basic research. So it's a complex interplay of these things. So let's take the Asian tigers.
Yeah, and by the way, when I mentioned steel, I was talking about the Asian tigers. And one thing here is there's this problem where, once a country has become once one country, the US or Britain, has become very economically developed, other countries have, again, like an existential incentive to develop the same technologies and to do so quickly.
Sure.
And South Korea and Taiwan both developed their steel industries under those kinds of conditions. But I don't think that's really disagreeing with what you're saying. I just wanted to make that,
And I think look, it's one path, right? Mm-hmm. So it's one path that leads to growth. The question is, does it lead to optimal growth? Does it lead to the greatest growth? And I would say South Korea and Taiwan undermine their own people by not letting this happen organically and figuring out what the comparative advantage actually was and feeding off of that comparative advantage. Yes, they became rich very quickly by copying, but is that instilled in their societies a attitude of entrepreneurship, an attitude of innovation and ingenuity Is that a system and a mental attitude that is going to sustain those cultures, 100 years from now? They're going to have to evolve pretty quickly away from that if they want to really continue to grow, because now they've copied everything there's to copy. Now what? And yet they haven't instilled the right attitude in their culture to develop the kind of things that can grow them beyond just copying. I think Japan is an example of a country that had it both. A lot of the innovation happened organically. Entrepreneurs like Honda and I forget the names, but the different entrepreneurs for the auto industry and the electronics industry, they were supported at some point by the state, but it required entrepreneurial. It wasn't. And then the state did come in and said, we need this and we need that. And usually when the state said, we need this and we need that, they failed. The petrochemical and drug industries in Japan are good examples of that. And yet Japan, because they didn't support, they didn't encourage the individualism and the entrepreneurial culture that some Japanese had, that wasn't encouraged. That wasn't what was promoted, particularly in the 70s and 80s as they got richer and more successful. They crashed. And if you look at economic growth, over the last 20 or 30 years in Japan, it's basically flat, because once they reached the full limits of the copy model, they hadn't instilled in their population the ability then to innovate beyond that, and now they're stuck. And it's sad to see Japan being stuck, because they deserve, they have the capacity for so much more.
Why is it that in some parts of the world there is this innovative spirit? The true answer is, I'm sure, very complicated, but do you have any quick thoughts on that?
It's definitely got to do with culture. It's got to do with particular cultures and a particular focus on a desire to better oneself, and a cultural view that is a good thing, that betterment, that success is a positive thing. And you definitely had a shift in the West with the Enlightenment away from acceptance of the status quo, a lot of energy towards self-betterment. Deirdre McCluskey, who I know documents kind of the cultural shift towards an attitude of, no, success is good, making money is good, and achievement is good, and that happens in the 18th, early 19th century, but it starts kind of in Amsterdam in maybe the 17th century, and it's slowly through, I think, primarily philosophers and social thinkers and business success and the wealth created in Amsterdam. That model starts spreading in the West and start being embraced. It existed in Greece, in ancient Greece, and to some extent in Rome. And it exists in China, at least to some extent. The Chinese culture has that attitude of, go get it, go for it. And communism is an aberration in a sense that historically China up to has always advanced a lot, been very successful because of individual entrepreneurs and so on, then becomes authoritarian, crushes that, and then starts all over again, and seems to go through these cycles throughout its history. So I guess maybe communism is not an aberration, it's the authoritarian instinct that crushes entrepreneurship. But Chinese culture is very entrepreneurial. Western culture has been very entrepreneurial. I think the two ideas that allow the West to do it, and have now been embraced by China and in Asia, but historically China kind of got away without these ideas. So it's interesting how they did it. And the two ideas are basically the efficacy of the human mind, the efficacy of reason, the negation of superstition, mysticism, and just mystical explanations of the world. So the elevation of science, but really it's the elevation of the human mind, the efficacy of reason. And second is individualism, the sanctity of the individual, the importance of the individual, and the ability of the individual to use his mind. This is Aristotle. So the West has benefited from the fact that we had Aristotle. Aristotle is the father of the entrepreneurial mind, because he gives, from moral perspective, he assigns your moral responsibility, your happiness, your success as a human being. And he gives you the tools to be successful, i.e. logic and reason. And to the extent that Aristotle is the dominant attitude in a culture, to that extent, it's entrepreneurial. And I think Asia's imported that attitude. into its culture.
Do you think that China and more generally East Asian countries are capable of innovation going forward? Like they're going to innovate in ways, like they're not just going to copy?
So it depends. China has shown some significant ability to innovate.
Yeah.
China's ahead in certain areas. China's ahead of the United States and ahead of the West in areas where they don't regulate and don't control. For example, fintech now, but now that they started to regulate fintech and they just broke up Ant, which is Jack Ma's big company. Maybe they'll stop innovating because the state will start interfering.
And that's largely probably for authoritarian reasons.
Absolutely.
Like,
so the enemy of innovation is authoritarianism. And so China is trying to straddle these two worlds. They're trying to embrace innovation in the private sector while at the same time have political oppression.
Maintaining control.
Once in a while, stepping into the economic sector and shutting stuff down in an authoritarian way. And they can't have their cake and eat it too. One has to give. And so far, the authoritarian instinct is surpassing everything else. Japan has shown signs that they can innovate. I think you're seeing that in other cultures. But look, the alternative to Korea and Taiwan is Hong Kong. Hong Kong had no industrial policy, does not have a steel industry, and yet per capita GDP is higher than both Taiwan and South Korea. They're richer than them in a sense. They developed, and you could argue Singapore is somewhere in between, but probably more similar to Hong Kong than Taiwan and South Korea, and both are richer. And both started up poorer and were incredibly successful. So whenever somebody says, well, what does it take? I say, well, look at Hong Kong. What did Hong Kong have? Nothing. No natural resources other than a port, but not much of a trading partner in communist China. So what did Hong Kong have? It had the rule of law, the protection of property rights. It had almost no regulations, almost no welfare state, almost no taxation. If any country adopts those with a culture that respects reason and in the individual and respects learning and education to some extent, it will be successful. It might take it longer, a little bit longer in some places than others, but you're seeing these things, these principles being adopted in Africa, and they're successful there when they are. Maybe not to the extent yet of Hong Kong, but maybe one day. That's the model, and that's the counterfactual. And if I would argue Korea would be richer and would have attained being rich faster if it adopted the Hong Kong model rather than the model they adopted.
Let me ask one final question, which is kind of taking the conversation in a new direction, but just since I've got you. I mean, one characteristic of the East Asian countries is that they're pretty mono-ethnic, and it's a pretty common perception, especially on the right, that multi-ethnic societies are lower trust societies on average. And trust is really critical for the successful functioning of capitalism. So what are your views on this? I mean, I assume you agree that societal trust is extremely important in order for capitalism to function well, but do you take seriously the argument that more ethnically homogeneous societies tend to have higher trust, and that might be a reason, if you favor capitalism and want capitalism to work well, that you should tailor your immigration policy accordingly?
No, and the big counterfactual to that is the United States of America, and the big period there again is the 19th century, where it was very multi-ethnic by the standards of the time, right? In those days, Italians and Irish and Germans hated each other's guts and viewed each other as different ethnic groups, as they did through World War II, if you will, right? And Jews and Chinese, but of course there was a lot of racism towards the Chinese, and yet trust developed in the United States. And if you compare Europe to the United States in terms of trust, I mean, United States of the past, maybe not the United States of today. United States has like way more trust than in the United States. You would do business on a handshake in the 19th century, early 20th century. You'd never do that in Europe. You'd never do that in Europe. Even in mono-ethnic societies like Sweden that everybody touts as these wonderful examples. First of all, they're not that wonderful. America's richer, more successful than Sweden is by far, and much more entrepreneurial and much more successful in many respects. And yet it's multi-ethnic. Israel, I would argue, is a multi-ethnic society because Jews came from all over the world, bringing very different ethnicities and cultures, and it's a multi-ethnic society that's incredibly successful. I don't know if in China, if in Hong Kong, they would consider it a mono-ethnic society. Hong Kong has Brits who are crucial. They have Chinese, but they have different Chinese minorities. They have Cantonese and Mandarin. They also have Indians. They, they have Indonesians. They have Filipinos. I mean, it's a multi-ethnic society by their standards. Maybe not by ours as Westerners. We look at it, oh, they all look Asians, therefore they're monotheistic. But that's ridiculous, right?
Is your guess that the United States will, over the course of the next 2 to 3 generations, develop more cohesion, and just right now we're going through a period of kind of ethnic tension and difference?
No, ethnic tension is a consequence of lack of freedom, and it's a consequence of bad ideas. So ethnic tension is completely a consequence of the mixed economy, of the fact that we had a mixed economy, we had Jim Crow laws, we had slavery. Those are violations of capitalism. Those are anti-capitalist institutions, and they're anti-freedom institutions. And then we've had kind of reverse. We've had affirmative action. We've had a Civil Rights Act that I think has a lot of flaws in it. And on top of that, we have bad ideas. We have ideas in the culture, both on the left and right, that support the idea that different races think differently, different races have different values, that we have collectivized American society in unthinkable ways, and it's getting worse, not better. So the only way we will shift back to a society that's more cohesive and is if we shift to more individualism. That's the funny thing. The more individualistic a society is, the more cohesive it is. Right. The more shared values you have, because we all want the freedom to pursue our own happiness. And if we realize that you're not pursuing your happiness at my expense, but we live under a system, and the system is built in a way to facilitate both of us pursuing our happiness as independent agents, that we're not stepping on each other's toes, that it's not a zero-sum game. That is the kind of society where you get cohesion, and where I think critical race theory right now is unbelievably destructive. But so is a lot of the kind of the white supremacy that turned into Western civilization supremacy, not in terms of culture, which I think it is superior, but associating that culture with race. And I see a lot of that on the right. White people invented this and white people invented that. As long as we think in those terms, it's a frigging disaster. And so I think the solution is individualism and reason. And individualism and reason would view a proper view of individualism and reason views racism as the most barbaric, stupid, primitive form of collectivism, which is really, really bad already. And this is even dumber than that, right? We need to go back to individualism. That's what will bring cohesion in this country. I see no indication we're heading in that direction, sadly. If anything, COVID has made us more collectivist and made us more, and has shown that Americans are more mindless. Europe is moving in a more collectivistic direction. I don't know where in the world is a bright spot in terms of moving us towards individualism. I've dedicated my life to that fight. So it's pretty depressing to see that, me losing, or us losing, those of us who are in the fight. But we are losing. There's no question. And it's difficult to watch. It's difficult to see.
Critical race theory and the pervasiveness of it just shows how much a small, committed minority can achieve. But yes, I agree with you.
But they can achieve it only because the culture is prepped for it, right? Mm-hmm. And what we need is to work on prepping the culture for better ideas. And I think ultimately we will be successful because ultimately our ideas are the right ideas. And I think human beings ultimately want to be successful. They want to be happy. They want to flourish. They want to be wealthy. They want to progress. And therefore they will once at some point they will gravitate towards a better philosophy, a better set of ideas that actually allows for all that.
Well, that is a better note to end on. It was great to see you, Yaron. Thanks so much for doing this.
Thanks, Brandon. And you know, let me know if there's anything I can do with the Mill series. It was fun. That debate was fun, and it's still getting huge numbers of views online.
No, it was great. And people honestly particularly enjoyed seeing you in person. So yeah, we'll be in touch again soon, I'm sure.
Excellent. Excellent.
All right. You take care.
Brandon. Bye.
Bye.